Can you imagine these words? Those were the last words my mother said to me before she slid a legal contract across the dinner table and effectively handed my life over to my brother. Sign it, Maya. You've always been a failure at family. The least you can do is help Anthony succeed. I was 25 years old. I had a degree I'd paid for myself, a career I'd built in silence, and a credit score I'd guarded like a fortress. Across from me, my brother was smirking over a $200,000 check our parents had just signed over to him for a house he didn't even have a lead on. 2 months later, the bank called them. And when they heard what I had done with that contract, their faces went white as ghosts. But by then it was way too late. I'm Maya Carter. I'm 31 now, standing in the floor-to-ceiling glass office of my own architectural firm, watching the city skyline glow at dusk. There's a document on my mahogany desk. It's a foreclosure notice for my parents' house, the one they put up as collateral for my brother's ego. After 6 years of silence, my mother wants to see me. She says they're losing everything. She says they're sorry. Funny thing about success, it always takes me back to that Tuesday night dinner. June 12, 2020. I remember walking into their house after a 10-hour shift at the firm. Bag over my shoulder, head full of the blueprints for the downtown library I'd just been assigned to lead. I was thinking about a quiet meal, about finally telling them about my promotion, normal daughter stuff. I had absolutely no idea that in less than an hour, I'd be labeled an outsider for refusing to bankroll my brother's latest lie. The moment I stepped through that front door, I knew something was wrong. My father, Ronald, was standing in the dining room looking like a man who'd just won the lottery, but his hands were shaking as he held a bottle of expensive champagne. My mother, Denise, was already seated, her face flushed with a terrifying kind of excitement. My brother Anthony stood right behind her. He was 28, 3 years older than me, and he had this expression on his face. Humble, grateful, the perfect picture of a visionary entrepreneur who'd finally gotten his big break. But I saw his eyes. I caught that little flicker he couldn't quite hide. Great. My father didn't even let me pull out my chair. He started talking like he'd found the Holy Grail. He said they were giving Anthony $200,000 to get him on his feet. He said they were finally investing in a winner. Then came the catch. Because Anthony's credit was a wasteland of unpaid bills and startup disasters, the bank needed a co-signer. They needed me. They said I was the stable one, the boring one. They said if I didn't sign, I was letting the family down. They said Anthony deserved this chance, and if I refused, it proved everything they'd ever said about me, that I was a cold, selfish failure who didn't know the meaning of the word family. To my parents, Anthony wasn't a 30-year-old man with a trail of evicted storefronts and angry investors. He was a misunderstood genius who just needed one more push to reach the summit. I called it the golden anchor. The way his constant failures didn't sink him, but instead dragged the rest of us down into the murky depths of his delusions. Over the last decade, I'd watched Denise and Ronald liquidate their savings to fund a revolutionary, artisanal water brand that lasted 3 months and an app for dog meditation that never made it past the home screen. Each time they'd look at me and say, "Maya, you're stable, you have your little job at the firm. Anthony needs this more." The $200,000 was supposed to be our inheritance from Grandma Beatrice, a fund specifically set aside for both of us to have a head start in life. It was intended to be split down the middle. But as I sat at that dinner table watching Anthony swirl his expensive wine, I realized the split had been quietly erased. They weren't just giving him his half, they were giving him mine too, and then asking me to ensure the rest with my own signature. They thought I was just a draftsperson because I didn't brag. They didn't realize that while Anthony was busy spending their retirement on high-end office furniture for businesses that didn't exist, I had worked my way up to a senior associate role at one of the top architectural firms in the state. I wasn't just drawing lines, I was designing the very skylines they admired from a distance. I had built a life of ironclad credit and strategic investments precisely because I knew I'd never have a safety net. "It's an investment in the family name, Maya," my father said, his voice thick with a forced heartiness that didn't reach his eyes. "When Anthony's real estate venture takes off, he'll pay you back. It's a win-win." I looked at Anthony, who couldn't even meet my gaze, and I saw the truth. This wasn't a house fund. It was a ransom payment. And they were expecting me to pay for the rope they were using to tie themselves to his sinking ship. The morning after that disastrous dinner, I didn't head to my drafting table. Instead, I sat in my office and opened my professional terminal, the glow of the dual monitors reflecting in my glasses like a digital interrogation lamp. In my world, developers aren't just names on a contract. They are blueprints. I knew how to read the structural integrity of a company just as easily as I could read the load-bearing capacity of a steel beam. Anthony had bragged about Summit Peak Holdings, the firm he claimed was bringing him on as a junior partner for a massive residential project. He'd painted a picture of glass towers and prestige. But when I ran the search through the commercial real estate database we use for vetting contractors, there was nothing. No portfolio, no permit history, and no brick-and-mortar address. I dug deeper, pulling the corporate filing records from the Secretary of State's website. My heart sank as the audit of souls began. Summit Peak was a shell company, registered 3 months ago to a P.O. box in a strip mall. The principal owner wasn't a developer. It was a name I recognized from Anthony's old poker night circles. A man whose reputation for predatory lending was well known in the local dive bars. I wasn't looking at a real estate partnership. I was looking at a money laundering funnel. Anthony wasn't buying a house. He was being squeezed. The $200,000 down payment my parents were bleeding out for him wasn't going toward a front porch and a picket fence. It was going to disappear into a black hole of debt, used to pay off the sharks Anthony had invited into his life. The most chilling part wasn't the fraud. It was the realization that my parents' names were already being used as bait. By asking me to co-sign, Anthony wasn't just trying to steal my credit. He was trying to use me as the final structural support for a building that was already on fire. He was willing to let me take the fall when the Summit Peak house of cards inevitably collapsed. I sat back in my chair, the silence of my office feeling heavy and cold. They wanted me to be a failure in my family? Fine. I was going to be the most thorough auditor they had ever met. Discovery is often a quiet thing, but it hits with the force of a wrecking ball. While Anthony was out celebrating his partnership at an upscale steakhouse, undoubtedly on our parents' dime, I stayed late at the office, digging through the public records of the county recorder's office. I was looking for a paper trail on the $200,000, hoping against hope that my parents had at least used their liquid savings. But as the PDF loaded on my screen, the air left my lungs. There it was, filed just 10 days prior, a deed of trust. Ronald and Denise hadn't just handed over Grandma Beatrice's inheritance. They had leveraged the very roof over their heads. They had taken out a second mortgage on the family home, the house I'd grown up in, the house my father had spent 30 years paying off, to fund Anthony's latest vision. The math was devastating. Between the new monthly payments and their modest retirement income, they were one missed check away from a total collapse. They were 65 years old, standing on the edge of a financial cliff, and they were smiling because they thought they were being supportive. I leaned back, the blue light of the monitor making the office feel like a tomb. My mother's voice from the night before echoed in my head, calling me selfish for not co-signing. She didn't realize that by refusing I wasn't attacking Anthony. I was trying to stop the bleeding. They had emptied the nest egg and then set the nest on fire. The worst part was the signature on the secondary loan application. Beside my father's shaky scrawl was a witness signature that looked suspiciously like Anthony's girlfriend's handwriting. They were being picked clean by a parasite who wore the face of a son, and they were too blinded by the golden child glow to see the shadow he was casting over their future. I realized then that I couldn't just walk away and let them fail. If I did, they'd be homeless by Christmas. I had to do something they'd never forgive me for. I had to become the person who controlled their debt before someone else did. To my family, my silence was the white flag of a failure who had finally accepted her place. I played the part of the wounded daughter to perfection, declining Sunday dinners with a soft, trembling voice and letting my mother's disappointed voicemails go to a full inbox. Behind that mask of hurt, however, I was operating with a cold, surgical efficiency. Anthony was so busy measuring the drapes for an office he didn't own that he never bothered to look at who was actually buying up the distressed paper on his empire. Through a private LC I'd established for my consulting work, I began reaching out to the various creditors Anthony had left in his wake. His failed dog meditation app had left a trail of unpaid cloud hosting fees and marketing debts. His artisanal water business still had outstanding leases on warehouse equipment. I started small, picking up these debt notes for pennies on the dollar. I was becoming the silent ghost in his machine, the invisible hand that held the strings to his past disasters. Then came the centerpiece. Anthony had secured a high-interest private loan to secure a prestige storefront for Summit Peak, a glass-fronted trap in the trendy part of town. He spent his afternoons there, leaning against the counter in a suit he couldn't afford, bragging to anyone who would listen about his limitless growth. He didn't realize that the lender, a man who cared more about quick liquidation than long-term interest, was more than happy to sell that debt to a discreet institutional buyer. Me. I sat in my car outside that storefront one Tuesday watching him through the window as he laughed with a group of investors, who looked like they were barely out of college. He looked so confident, so sure that he was finally the winner our parents wanted him to be. He had no idea that the very floor he was standing on, the desk he was leaning against, and the debt that allowed him to breathe were now legally mine. Every time Denise called to tell me how proud she was that Anthony was finally finding success, I just smiled. They wanted to believe in the myth of the golden child. I was just waiting for the moment the bill finally came due. The fluorescent lights of the First National Bank felt like a cold interrogation, but the woman sitting across from me, a senior loan officer named Mrs. Gable, was surprisingly warm. She had worked with my parents for 20 years, and she looked at me with a mixture of pity and professional concern. "Maya," she said, tapping a folder on her desk. "I was surprised to see you weren't on the latest paperwork. Your parents mentioned you were unavailable." I didn't correct her on their definition of unavailable. That I leaned in. "I'm conducting a private audit of their liabilities, Mrs. Gable. I need to see the full scope of the debt associated with the property." She hesitated, then sighed, sliding a document toward me. "This came through 3 days after the second mortgage. An additional $50,000 line of credit for home improvements. Your father signed for it electronically." My blood ran cold as I looked at the digital signature. I had seen my father's handwriting every Christmas and birthday for 25 years. He was a man of loops and heavy pressure. This signature was too clean, too fluid. It was the handwriting of someone who had spent their teenage years forging hall passes. It was Anthony's. "Mrs. Gable," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "My father hasn't used a computer without my help in a decade. He doesn't even know what a digital certificate is." The silence that followed was heavy. I wasn't just looking at favoritism anymore. I was looking at a felony. Anthony hadn't just taken their inheritance and their equity. He was now actively stealing their identity to fuel his Summit Peak fantasy. He was cannibalizing our parents' future, one fraudulent click at a time, and he was doing it because he knew they'd never call the police on their golden boy. I didn't report it. Not yet. If I called the cops now, the bank would freeze everything and my parents would be out on the street before the week was over. Instead, I had Mrs. Gable print a certified copy of the application. I walked out of that bank with a new kind of weapon in my bag. I wasn't just the silent partner anymore. I was the one holding the evidence that could put my brother in a jumpsuit. And as I watched the sun set over the city, I realized the failure of the family was the only one left with the power to decide who went to jail. The air in my parents' dining room was thick with the scent of roast chicken and desperation. It was the first time I'd agreed to sit at their table in weeks, and the tension was a physical weight. Anthony sat at the head of the table, his silk tie loosened, looking every bit the stressed executive. But I saw the frantic pulse in his neck and the way his eyes darted toward Denise every time the silence lasted too long. "The Summit Peak project is at a critical juncture," Anthony announced, pushing his plate away as if he were too busy for something as mundane as eating. "The builders are ready to break ground, but the local council is dragging their feet on the utility permits. I need another $30,000 to grease the wheels of the consultancy firm." My mother looked at my father, her eyes pleading. "Ronald, we have to help him. We've come this close." My father looked older than I had ever seen him. He stared at his glass of water, his hands resting on the table. "The line of credit is tapped out, Anthony. We don't have another 30. Anthony's face shifted, the mask of the visionary, slipping to reveal the petulant child beneath. "So what? You're just going to let me fail now? After everything?" He turned his gaze on me, his eyes narrowing. "Maya has it. She's been sitting on her architect salary while I've been out here trying to build a legacy for this family." "I don't have it, Anthony," I said calmly, taking a slow sip of my water. "And even if I did, I wouldn't give it to a project that doesn't exist. You selfish bitch, he spat, standing up so quickly his chair screeched against the hardwood. You've always hated that I'm the one who actually does something with my life. I didn't flinch. I reached into my bag and pulled out a stack of manila folders, sliding them across the table. They weren't blueprints. That car parked in the driveway? The lease was 4 months past due. I bought the debt note from the dealership yesterday. Technically, Anthony, you're driving my car. And that office in the Heights? The one with the glass front and the fancy espresso machine? The landlord sold your defaulted lease to a private LLC last Tuesday. My LLC. The silence that followed was absolute. Anthony's face went from flushed red to a sickly, translucent white. My parents looked at the folders, then at me, then back at their golden boy. I'm not the failure of this family, I said, my voice as cold as the winter rain. I'm the only person in this room who actually owns anything. And as of 10 minutes ago, I'm also your landlord. The boardroom at First National Bank was a sanctuary of glass and mahogany, a place where fortunes were usually made, but today, it was where a legacy would be dismantled. My parents sat huddled together, looking small in their oversized leather chairs, while Anthony paced the length of the room, his bravado manifesting as a frantic staccato rhythm. Mrs. Gable stood by the door, a silent witness to the impending collapse. This is an outrage, Maya. Anthony shouted, his voice cracking. You're interfering with a private business transaction. This $200,000 transfer is the only thing keeping the Summit Peak project alive. I didn't answer him. Instead, I opened my laptop and projected a series of bank statements onto the wall-mounted screen. Summit Peak isn't a project, Anthony. It's a funeral pyre. I pointed to a string of outgoing wires. These aren't payments to contractors or utility companies. These are transfers to the Grand Horizon, an offshore gambling platform. You didn't lose the money to bad luck. You lost it to a digital blackjack table. My mother let out a small wounded sound, but I wasn't finished. I clicked the next file, displaying the digital signature from the unauthorized line of credit. And this, I said, looking directly at my father, is a felony. He didn't just spend grandma's inheritance. He forged your name to steal $50,000 more to cover his markers when the sharks started circling. The room went deathly quiet. The bank system signaled a pending alert. The final wire transfer for the $200,000 house fund was scheduled to trigger in 3 minutes. Anthony lunged toward the table, reaching for the authorization tablet, but Mrs. Gable was faster. With a single clinical keystroke, she flagged the account for fraudulent activity and froze the transfer. The funds are secured, Maya, she said, her voice steady. Anthony collapsed into a chair, the golden child mask finally shattering to reveal a hollow, desperate man who had gambled away his family's soul. My father stared at the screen, at the cold evidence of his son's betrayal, his face sagging with the weight of 30 years of misplaced pride. The failure had just saved them from total ruin, but as I looked at their devastated faces, I realized that while I had saved their money, I had finally destroyed the illusion that kept them whole. The fallout was swift and devoid of the theatricality Anthony usually employed. There were no grand speeches, no desperate excuses that could survive the clinical glare of the bank's forensic audit. When the sheriff's deputies arrived at the boardroom to address the felony forgery, Anthony didn't fight. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, stripped of the expensive suit and the unearned confidence, as he was led away in a pair of steel cuffs that didn't care about his limitless potential. Denise and Ronald sat in the wake of the storm, the silence of the boardroom ringing in their ears. My mother was clutching her handbag, the one that still contained the loan application she'd begged me to sign, as if it were a life raft for a ship that had already touched the ocean floor. My father wouldn't look at me. He stared at his hands, his knuckles white, realizing that the boring daughter was the only thing standing between him and a cardboard box. I've settled the secondary mortgage, I said, my voice steady but weary. I used the funds I gained from liquidating the debt notes I bought on Anthony's shell companies. The house is clear. The line is gone. My mother finally looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. Maya, we didn't know. We just wanted him to have a chance. You wanted him to have my chance, I corrected her, the words tasting like copper. You spent 30 years trying to build a pedestal for a man who was happy to bury you in his debt. You called me a failure because I didn't play along with the lie. But the person you called a failure is the only reason you still have a front door to lock tonight. I stood up, smoothing my blazer. I had done what I came to do. I had cut the rot out of the family tree, but I hadn't done it for their gratitude. I had done it to stop the ghost of Grandma Beatrice from watching her life's work be gambled away. As I walked toward the glass doors, I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a survivor who had finally reached the shore. The morning sun hit the cedar siding of my new home, turning the wood a deep, honeyed gold. I stood on the back deck, a cup of coffee steaming in my hands, looking out over the valley. This house wasn't just a structure of glass, steel, and stone. It was the physical manifestation of every hour I'd spent working in silence while my family was busy shouting about my brother's imaginary empires. There was no second mortgage here. No forged signatures. No desperate lies whispered over dinner. Every nail, every beam, and every permit had been paid for with the boring salary of the daughter they had written off. I designed it to be a sanctuary of light, the exact opposite of the dark, heavy rooms where I'd been told I was a failure. In the weeks since the bank meeting, the silence from my parents had been absolute. They were living in the house I now technically protected, staying there because of my mercy rather than their own planning. Anthony was awaiting trial, his world reduced to the four walls of a cell that no amount of family favoritism could unlock. They had finally realized that the golden child was the lead, and the failure was the only one who knew how to build a foundation that didn't crumble. I walked inside, my bare feet clicking against the polished concrete floors. I stopped at the hallway where I had framed my architect's license, the one Denise had called a hobby 3 years ago. Next to it sat a small framed photo of Grandma Beatrice. I think she would have liked the kitchen. It was built for someone who intended to stay, someone who didn't need to run from the truth. I realized then that being their failure was the most successful thing I had ever achieved. If I had been their version of a success, I would have been just another passenger on Anthony's sinking ship. By being the outsider, the unseen child, I had gained the perspective to see the rot before it took me down with them. I wasn't just an architect of buildings anymore. I was the architect of my own peace. I set my coffee down, opened my laptop, and started a new set of blueprints. This time I wasn't fixing someone else's mess. I was designing a future that belonged entirely to me. If this story resonates with you, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening. See you in the next one.